Greetings to everyone. My name is Yevhen Krapivin. I'm a content editor of JustTalk platform, and today we are going to talk with Marko Milanovic, who is an international lawyer, about international lawyer stuff. So, firstly, I started with reminders that our platform, we are mostly talking about international law, about criminal procedure law, and it is rarely then we appear that we face it with problems of international law, of international criminal law, and mostly it was in context of Donbass, of Crimea, and or mostly with investigation in absentia, in internal legislation, and again, not within international law as material law. So when the war started, I mean, the new stage of the 8-year war on 24 February, it appeared that our knowledge of international law is not enough to understand how to bring to the responsibility the Putin, his cronies, Russia for war crimes, for crime of aggression, for crimes against humanity. And we started to investigate, to research some quality materials on international law issues and mostly of international criminal law, international criminal court, and so on. And maybe starting for the March, for the 1st of March, every day, each day, I started with reading the JustTalk blog. It is a European Journal of International Law blog, and the first article, the first piece that I was faced here was a piece of Marko Milanovic. It was some reflection on Ukrainian file to ICTY, International Court of Justice of UN, and Marko reflect his thoughts on the perspective of our file on the on Convention on Prevention of Genocide. Then I read a lot of materials on this platform, and Marko is co-editor of the JustTalk platform, and it is great that today, after the months, maybe 1.5 months, we meet some kind in person, but of course online, and we have this possibility to discuss international law on Ukrainian ground. And what is the purpose of this meeting? Well, and I switch my word to Anastasia, who is moderator of this discussion. Anastasia, please, the floor is yours.
Hello, Yevhen. Thank you very much for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Hello, Marko. I'm very happy to be here. For those who don't know me, I'm a member of JustTalk team, Just Group organization. Now I'm doing my master degree at the University of Nottingham. And that's why I'm especially pleased to be here today and talk with Professor Marko Milanovic, who is my professor at the University of Nottingham and professor of public international law there and co-director of Human Rights Law Center at the same university. I'm also so happy to see all of you, and don't want to make my introduction very long, so I just want to say that I hope that soon all of us will celebrate the victory and we'll meet in person in Kiev, and we'll do our JustTalk event as before, offline and in person. Professor Marko Milanovic is also was appointed by the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights as a high-level expert who assists the Commissioner in examination of alleged human rights violation committed in Belarus. And from the latest news, in the end of the March this year, government of Ukraine announced the creation of a legal task force on accountability for crimes committed in Ukraine. And Marko is one of the leading academics in the field of international humanitarian law who will support the task force. This is another great news for Ukraine, and thank you very much, Marko, for that as well. I'm giving you the floor, and maybe before we start our talk, you can add something more about your experience about the topic we'll discuss later.
Thank you so much, Anastasia. Thank you so much, Evgeny. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I hope you're all safe wherever you are currently in Ukraine. So you asked me sort of to say something about myself that's sort of relevant to today. So I suppose the one thing that I can tell you that is relevant is sort of a bit of where I'm from. And that's that I'm from the former Yugoslavia, specifically from Serbia. I'm currently in Belgrade, the capital of Serbia, the capital of the former Yugoslavia. And why is this relevant? It's relevant because, unfortunately, there's a lot of deja vu, you know, about what's currently going on in Ukraine compared to what happened in my country in the 1990s. There are some big differences, but there are also some very big similarities. The big difference is that the wars that we had, and it was more than one, happened in the context of the dissolution of the former Yugoslavia, whereas sort of the war in Ukraine is somehow a sequel or the prolongation of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but is happening many decades after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Another big difference is that, you know, all of the parties to the conflicts in the former Yugoslavia were relatively small, weak countries. Whereas, of course, with regard to Ukraine and Russia, the major problem is that the aggressor, you know, one of the parties to the conflict is a major power and a permanent member of the Security Council. So there are many differences, but there are also quite a few similarities. You know, one similarity is really senseless war fighting for territorial conquest, followed by war crimes and crimes against humanity committed on a systematic level that led to, in Bosnia, so the country next door, to 100,000 people dead over the course of some 4 years, 60% of whom were soldiers, 40% of whom were civilians, 2/3 of whom were Bosnian Muslims or Bosniaks. Then we had the war in Croatia and the war in Kosovo. Another similarity is that sort of I can empathize with you, because even though Serbia was spared as such of most of the war, in 1999, we had a NATO intervention against Serbia, which was seen by and large as the bad guy in the conflicts of the 1990s, which resulted in sort of 77 days of NATO bombing Serbia in order to prevent atrocities committed by Serbian troops in Kosovo. There are many, many parallels. Kosovo, Crimea, we can discuss all of those to the extent you're interested. Another big similarity is nationalism amongst all parties. And a horrible legacy of the 1990s is that this nationalism is still prevalent, a sort of disease that plagues all of the societies in the former Yugoslavia, including my own, including Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia, and Kosovo. Amongst the worst crimes committed in the 1990s was a genocide. And we can talk about that word later on if you'd like. The only genocide recognized legally as such after World War II, in a small eastern Bosnian city called Srebrenica, where Bosnian Serb forces killed some 8,000 Muslim men and boys in roughly 3-4 days in July 1995. Today, as I said, you know, there is this enormous upwell of nationalism still existing in the former Yugoslavia. And the vast majority of Serbs, so my people, do not actually recognize that these crimes had ever happened, or only talk about their own victimhood. And that leads to a number of interesting things. So for example, just one street away from where I live in the center of Belgrade is a mural to Ratko Mladic, the worst sort of genocidal war criminal of the 1990s. And 2 streets away is a mural to Vladimir Putin. So in this country, actually, we had a protest in support of Russia before there was a protest in support of Ukraine. I'm just giving you sort of how it sort of is, so that you understand the poisonous legacy of the conflict that still exists in our societies. Another major similarity is that you said, Yevgeny, you did not necessarily need to know much about international law before the whole thing started in your country. And that's sort of how it was here, right? But there are countries like mine, like yours, where simply by being there, by living there, you cannot escape international law and international legal issues. They come to you, right? If you live in Switzerland, you don't have to care about international law. But if you live in Serbia, Croatia, or Ukraine, you know, it's sort of around you on a daily basis. And one part of international law that came to us is international criminal law, and we'll talk about that in a minute, Anastasia and I, about the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, this accountability mechanism that we had here. And so the final thing sort of to stop about my background is that I did my primary legal education here, and when in Serbia, and as I was doing it, I worked for a human rights NGO, like many of you have had that type of similar experience. And a huge sort of facet of the work of human rights NGOs in the Balkans has been the opposition of this kind of work on justice, accountability, human rights, rule of law, to horrible nationalist authoritarian tendencies in sort of mainstream society. And that has inevitably sort of shaped my own sort of career and what I wanted to do and where I went afterwards. So I hope that's okay for introduction. I didn't bore you to death.
Thank you very much, for Marco. And as we already started talking about what is similar and what is not between both wars, can we, and what Yevgeny mentioned before, that in the Ukrainian legal community, especially at the beginning of the war, there are a lot of mentions about Nuremberg Tribunal and how it can be useful to Ukraine. What can you say about that? Is it a good example, or it's better take lessons from Yugoslavia Tribunal, maybe somehow Rwanda or other existence tribunals? Can Ukraine take useful tips from that?
I suppose there are some lessons to be learned from Nuremberg. And by the way, there was Nuremberg, then there were these so-called subsequent Nuremberg proceedings, and then there was also Tokyo. There was another tribunal in the Far East that dealt with Japanese war criminals. But inevitably, the more recent lessons are the more important ones. Let me put it to you that way. So let me say a few words about Nuremberg. The reason why Nuremberg is not the right model here is that, as Yevgeny was saying, it was a court established by the 4 victorious powers. So by the United States, the Soviet Union, France, and the United Kingdom, having won and completely conquered Germany, on the basis essentially of that authority, they established a military tribunal. The judges came from these countries, these 4 countries. The prosecutors came from these 4 countries. The only people put on trial were the Germans. None of the victorious powers ever prosecuted any of its people for bad things they did. And they did do bad things, you know, think firebombing of Dresden, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That, by the way, has major implications for whether Ukraine should prosecute Ukrainians for doing bad things to Russians, which, I mean, to just be very brief about it, you certainly should, yeah? But Nuremberg was not like that. Nuremberg was victor's justice. And that had sort of various consequences down the line. Now, the reason why this is not a good model is simply because it's not like Ukraine is going to conquer Russia and can therefore set up such a tribunal. It's not going to happen. Nor will NATO intervene on your behalf. The way it intervened, for example, against my country in 1999. It's just not going to happen. So because it's not going to happen, you need a different model. The model of the two so-called modern ad hoc tribunals also doesn't exactly work for you. So that's the model of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. How were they established? Both of these tribunals were established, the first in 1993, the second a year later, by a decision of the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council has the power to make binding decisions under Chapter 7 of the Charter, including authorizing the use of force against states, but also measures short of using force. And sort of as a measure to establish peace in the former Yugoslavia, after the Security Council was unblocked, after the end of the Cold War, the Council created the first modern International Criminal Tribunal, the ICTY, the Tribunal on the former Yugoslavia. Rwanda came a year later. Rwanda was a very different conflict. Even though it had international dimensions, it was mostly, at least at that point in time, confined to the territory of Rwanda, where some 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were killed by Hutu extremists in a few months in early 1994. Now, the way these two tribunals were designed essentially is that they were subsidiary organs of the Security Council, and they could count on the Security Council for support, for enforcement, also for money. Russia supported at the time the establishment of these two tribunals. The reason why this is, of course, not going to be a model now is because Russia is not going to be crazy, at least while Vladimir Putin is in power, to support the creation through the Security Council, where it has a veto, of any kind of ad hoc tribunal. There were some other tribunals established in later years. For example, the Special Tribunal for Sierra Leone, which was established via a treaty between the United Nations and the government of Sierra Leone. Now that is some kind of model for Ukraine, in the sense that some kind of tribunal could be established, for instance, by agreement between Ukraine and the United Nations, or Ukraine and the Council of Europe, or Ukraine and some fellow states who want to support Ukraine in the creation of an ad hoc tribunal. But then there is the Permanent International Criminal Court, which was established in 1998 via the Rome Statute of the ICC. And it's a very different organization. It's a treaty-based organization whose jurisdiction Ukraine has accepted. So Ukraine is not a party to the ICC statute, but through this ad hoc declaration, it accepted the jurisdiction of the ICC. And as you could see on your TV and papers, the ICC prosecutor Karim Khan has already been on several visits to Ukraine, and his investigators are in Ukraine. Now I'm going to cut this short and move to the substance of the crimes, because that matters a great deal. And then I'll talk a bit about the experiences of the Yugoslav Tribunal and what you can expect and what you cannot expect. When it comes to the substance of the crimes, there's really four major categories of international crimes. The first is aggression or crimes against peace. This was actually originally a Soviet invention. And these crimes were introduced in the London Charter of the Nuremberg Tribunal, and were actually the first item in the indictment against the Nazis. The first charge against the Nazis is that they unlawfully started the war. That's aggression. But then there's three other crimes: genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. And they are very different from aggression. Whereas aggression is about whether you can lawfully start a war, whether Russia had the right to invade Ukraine in the first place. The other three crimes are about really how you fight the war. And they are independent from the issue of who was guilty in starting it. And so that means, for example, that Ukraine or Ukrainian soldiers, while defending their country, can nonetheless commit war crimes or say crimes against humanity. If a Ukrainian soldier kills a Russian POW, a prisoner of war, that is a war crime, even though Ukraine is defending itself from Russia's aggression. Now, the reason I'm saying this is because in the minds of the vast majority of normal people, whether Ukraine, Russia, or here in the former Yugoslavia, these two questions, is the war just or legal in some broad sense, or who's guilty for starting it, and the issue of how the war is being fought are often conflated. And so what happens in the former Yugoslavia is that everybody blames everybody else for starting the war, and everybody blames everybody else for committing the atrocities in the war. Whereas, again, as I said, even if you're the defender, you can commit an atrocity crime. Okay. Now, in Nuremberg, as I said, the first charge was waging aggressive war, the crimes against peace. Genocide was not tried in Nuremberg. It was defined in a subsequent UN convention, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, and is essentially defined very, very strictly, very, very narrowly as committing certain acts like murder with the specific intention of physically or biologically destroying a national, racial, ethnic, or religious group as such. Essentially, the model is the Holocaust. Yeah, the destruction of the European Jews by Germany. Crimes against humanity, on the other hand, are a much broader concept. They include all sorts of things, including, for example, persecution, forced deportation, but also murder, extermination, etc., as crimes against humanity. Interestingly, both of these crimes, genocide and crimes against humanity, have their intellectual origin in your country. So it was lawyers who come from Lviv, Raphael Lemkin and Hirsch Lauterpacht, both really Polish Jews from Ukraine, who came up with the idea and the terminology of genocide and crimes against humanity immediately before and during World War II. And then finally, we have war crimes, which are essentially violations of the laws and customs of war, and violations of the grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. Killing a prisoner of war, torturing a prisoner of war, killing a civilian, launching indiscriminate attacks against civilians, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so that's sort of the panoply of these crimes. When it comes to the former Yugoslavia, there was a deliberate choice by the Security Council not to include aggression into the crimes over which the ICTY had jurisdiction. So the ICTY never, for example, tried the dictator of my country, Slobodan Milosevic, for starting the war in Bosnia, say. The ICTY had jurisdiction only over the atrocity crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. The ICC, on the other hand, the Permanent International Criminal Court, does have jurisdiction over aggression as well. But it was a late addition introduced through these very specific amendments to the Rome Statute of the ICC. And these amendments have created a very narrow definition of aggression and a very convoluted, very strict jurisdictional regime. The bottom line of this is that the ICC has jurisdiction in Ukraine on the basis of this ad hoc declaration made by Ukraine, but only over genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. It does not have jurisdiction over aggression because Russia is not a party to the Rome Statute or to the amendments. So you do have already an International Criminal Tribunal, the ICC, that can investigate the atrocity crimes. You don't need one more of those. If you want a new tribunal, that should be only for one thing, and that's aggression. The problem there is that there have been many sort of different models and ideas that we can talk about if you'd like, but none of those ideas will in practice be able to surmount the various legal and practical difficulties that arise. The main practical difficulty is that you're never going to be able to try high-level defendants, high-level officials of a state, unless the regime in that country is changed. So I'll come to this in a second. That is certainly the experience of the former Yugoslavia. So even though we as lawyers want there to be accountability mechanisms, the reality of the world is that until the Putin regime changes, falls, whatever, they are not really going to be put on trial, the high-level officials of that regime. It will not happen, okay? The legal problem is the issue of these so-called immunities. And the problem is whether you can ever create an International Criminal Tribunal without Russia's consent and without the role of the Security Council that can remove the immunities of a head of state like Vladimir Putin. Now, I will finish my very long answer to your very first question, Anastasia, on the practicalities of this. So the ICTY was established, as I said, in 1993. It had its very first case in 1995. This random Bosnian Serb guy, super low level, a prison camp guard called Duško Tadić, who was stupid enough to go to Germany. And the Germans arrested him and sent him to the ICTY. Huge big case, okay? In the end, it turned out to be very successful. Certainly when it comes to adjudicating the gravest crimes of the wars of the 1990s. In particular, the entire political and military leadership of Serbia, my country, and the Bosnian Serbs ended up in prison. Now that's a hopeful message. None of us fighting against that regime here in the 1990s ever thought that this would happen. But it did happen. Yeah. So there is some hope. The reason why it happened, though, is that we overthrew the dictatorship. There were elections in 2000, echoes of Lukashenko, sort of. Milosevic lost them, but instead of the state security services suppressing an uprising of the people, they made a deal with the democratic opposition. Milosevic was arrested and soon was sent to The Hague. Later on, another president of Serbia, prime minister, many generals and so on went to The Hague. The same thing happened in Bosnia, where you had a NATO military presence and they could arrest guys. And so both the Bosnian Serb president, Radovan Karadzic, and the main general, Ratko Mladic, ended up in The Hague. So did a lot of more minor characters. Croatia also sent some of its high-ranking generals to The Hague. Its president escaped prosecution by dying, but they did send some of their most high-ranking generals who were very controversially acquitted. So Serbia and Croatia cooperated with the ICTY. They cooperated, however, because they were forced to by economic and political pressure from the West. That, unfortunately, is not the scenario that's likely to unfold with regard to Russia. And so that's my less hopeful message. So even though there's a big lesson for Ukraine from Yugoslavia in the 1990s, if I was a betting man, I would not bet on things developing the way they did in Russia. But we can talk about this. So I hope this is a good answer to question one.
This is a great question to answer to question one, Marco. Thank you very much. And during your speech, I noticed like a few extra questions to you, and then you answered to those questions. So I'm not going to ask them again. And because your examples were so bright that we still have a hope that we can bring those war criminals to justice in the end, even if it's going to happen in a few years or in many years. I hope not too many. So I was going to ask you, maybe because we have a lot of practitioners here listening to us, maybe you can talk a little bit what is significant now when the war is ongoing, what is important not to forget to do, like maybe about collecting evidence or saving information, or maybe there were some fails before that we can not to repeat now, so it will help us fight later when we'll bring all of those people to justice, all those Russians.
Right. Not just Russians. So you also need to bring to justice everyone Ukrainians who do bad things, because that's an unfortunate lesson of the former Yugoslavia. You had a complete nationalistic sort of split, right? So nobody wanted to prosecute their own people. They were all heroes. When the Croatian generals were acquitted in the ICTY, after a very controversial judgment, this is a case called Gotovina and others, prosecutor versus Gotovina and others, by 3 votes to 2, my people, the Serbs, were devastated because we saw these generals that having committed the ethnic cleansing of hundreds of thousands of Serbs from Croatia in 1995. Croatia saw them as heroes. They sent the state plane to pick them up, and they had a red carpet welcomed by the president and the prime minister. And I very much hope you don't do the same thing. Despite the very human impulse that, you know, a Ukrainian soldier fighting for his country is a hero and should be lauded and respected. But in war, people do horrible things. And if they're guilty, they need to be punished, even if they're one of our own. Now, in terms of what can be done practically, collecting evidence is the big thing. Collecting evidence in a timely, speedy, verifiable way that is going to survive scrutiny before courts or other accountability mechanisms in the years to come. Let me give you a very specific example. Currently, Ukraine has in its custody, let's say, hundreds of Russian prisoners of war. We don't know how many. I mean, probably none of us knows how many. All of these people will likely go back to Russia when the war ends. There's actually a duty to repatriate prisoners of war in Article 118 of the Third Geneva Convention. Now is the time for Ukrainian investigators to interview these people, to get their statements, and to interview them in the most rigorous, just way that's possible, without coercion, while respecting fully all of their rights under both international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, but also the European Convention on Human Rights, which, remember, continues applying to Ukraine and to Russia, but also to Ukraine in the conflict. So, for example, I would suggest that every Russian prisoner of war whom Ukrainian authorities think has some value for criminal investigation purposes should be interviewed in the presence of an investigative judge, should be given a lawyer. The interview should be recorded audio-visually, not simply transcribed, right? So that you have a record where you can prove that the person was speaking willingly, that they were not being coerced, that you would allow cross-examination of the witness to explore any gaps in what the prosecution, for example, could say, and so on and so forth. The preservation of physical evidence, obviously, is a big issue. This is something Ukrainian authorities are already doing. In my country, or in the former Yugoslavia, we had many mass graves that needed to be excavated. Sometimes a substantial time after the events. So just, for example, in my city, in Belgrade, which is a city of some 2 million people, on the outskirts of our city, there's a military airport, and there was a mass grave of Kosovo Albanians brought hundreds of kilometers from Kosovo. They were killed there, and their bodies were brought here with some 700 bodies in that mass grave. But the sort of forensic examination happened years after this was done, if you see what I mean. Ideally, you need to preserve physical evidence while it's fresh. And that again is something that Ukraine is already doing, and the ICC is doing, because the ICC, remember, is present in Ukraine. So those are really some of the practical sort of points that I would like to make. I mean, they're a bit obvious, but it needs to be said. The big thing we have now that really didn't exist in the 1990s is this whole open source evidence. So the fact that Ukraine has a website and says to people in Ukraine, submit your evidence on prisoners of war or war crimes, in Ukraine via this website, that on social media and so on, you have so many videos, so many photos being circulated and so on. A lot of that evidence is being collected and can be analyzed and preserved. The big issue is, can you prove that it has not been tampered with? And that, it's reliable.
I see. Thank you, Marko. And especially about your last point, I guess, because we live now in 2022 and everything happening very quickly. And as you said, social media and internet is full of those pictures and comments and stories of the people. We probably should not lose the moment and investigate and save and doing cups right now when it's still relevant. Thank you. We talked a little bit already about responsibilities and immunities of top-level persons, but I would like also bring the question about the responsibility of media, and we talked about this with you a little bit before our event, because when we were discussing with our team what else can be interesting to discuss from the experience of past tribunals. And as you said in the beginning, that Rwanda tribunal is a little bit different from, or very different from the situation and the war we have now, and maybe can't be that relevant for us. But there is a very interesting case about media in Rwanda. The name of the radio station was Télévision Libre d'Émile Colline. I tried my best with my posh French accent. And I'll just shortly explain what is the case for those who maybe haven't heard about it. That radio was a Rwandan radio station, and it played a significant role in inciting the Rwandan genocide in 1884. And during the genocide, the radio station acted as a source for propaganda by inciting hatred and violence against Tutsis and by advocating the annihilation of all Tutsis in Rwanda. The radio reported victories, the latest massacres and political events in a way that promoted their anti-Tutsi agenda. And as a result, in the end, in 2003, at the tribunal, life sentences were requested for radio's leaders Nahimana, Barayagwiza, and they were charged with genocide, incitement to genocide, and crimes against humanity. And same happened to some announcers of the radio who were sentenced to life imprisonment. Now we see a lot of very powerful propaganda in Russia from the Russian side. They keep posting and making videos and TV shows where they openly say about that this war is absolutely justified and that Russians doing a great job, and we can collect and see a lot of comments of regular people in the internet. Can you please talk a little bit about this? Explain to us, can we make that media case from Rwanda as an example for us, for Ukraine? Can we, maybe there are other cases which we can use, and also how in the best way we can use the situation now for bringing those propagandist journalists to justice in the end?
Okay, so thanks so much for that, Anastasia. So I here again have to sort of disappoint you or strike a somewhat skeptical note. Sorry to do that, by the way. The first thing I would actually say is that this propaganda works. It is incredibly effective. And it's not something unique to Russia. Again, we had this here in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. And it's not simply propaganda on state TV or even on social media. It pervades the whole of society. It's also what children are taught in schools, right? The results of that type of propaganda that we had here is that people today live in completely parallel universes when the facts are concerned. Croats believe in crimes that were committed against Croats, but not when the Croats were the perpetrators. Serbs believe in crimes when Serbs were the victims, but not when they were the perpetrators. Albanians think about crimes, where they're the victims, but not when they're the perpetrators. It's like that. It's literally like that. They all live in their own little universe, and they never acknowledge what was done to the other side or what they did to the other side. To such extent that, for example, majorities, substantial majorities in both Serbia and the Bosnian Serb entity in Bosnia deny that the worst crime, the 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys who were killed in July 95 even happened, okay? So they live in divergent realities. Even though, by the way, they all speak the same language, well, with the exception of Albanians. They could all read each other's websites and books and newspapers, but they don't. They inhabit their own universes. Yeah. So even if, international tribunals and Ukrainian courts establish the truth, and even if Russian officials are put on trial and convicted, and even if Russian propagandists are put on trial and convicted, that will not, in and of itself, transform what people think in their heads. In their heads, most people, unfortunately, really intensely care about their own victimhood and have very little empathy about the other side. And that is unlikely to change. I mean, let me give another example. If the European Court of Human Rights establishes, as it might in a year or two, that Russia shot down the MH17 over Ukraine, do you think people in Russia will suddenly believe that simply because the European Court of Human Rights said so? No. Yeah. So unfortunately, the attitudes of people do not get changed simply through accountability efforts. And unless there is a change in regime in Russia, which I doubt there will be, you cannot expect the views of ordinary Russians to really be modified by whatever accountability mechanisms we use. Now, when it comes to prosecuting these propagandists in particular, experiences of this are very, very mixed. The first such case was actually not the ICTY, it was Nuremberg. There was this one awful, horrible guy called Julius Streichler, who was prosecuted, who ran this Nazi newspaper and was sentenced to death. Then we had the RTLM case, the media case, before the ICTR, but that dealt with a very specific crime, which is called direct and public incitement to genocide, which exists in the Genocide Convention, but does not exist for any other international crime. Essentially, if I stand up right now and simply say, kill all Ukrainians, by saying those words, I commit this crime, even if nobody's incited to do it. Yeah, the words alone are enough to constitute the offense. You don't have that for any of the other three international crimes. There you need to prove some mode of participation, that the propagandists actually instigated causally somebody to commit a crime. That the propagandists, if you use a theory of responsibilities like joint criminal enterprise, which was used quite a lot in the ICTY, that they significantly contributed to this joint criminal enterprise with the intention of doing that. It is very difficult to prove. So all of the propagandists here in my country, in the former Yugoslavia, whether Serb, Croat, Albanian, Bosnian, whatever, none of them were convicted before the ICTY, none of them. There was one guy from here called Šešelj who was prosecuted, but in the end, he was convicted because he also ran a paramilitary organization. So when you see all those horrible people on Russian state TV saying all those things, 99% the odds are those people are never going to get prosecuted. If they get prosecuted, they might get prosecuted because they're stupid enough to go to Paris for a vacation at some point, and they get nabbed for some kind of hate speech offense and get a very low penalty. But you know, this is the type of prosecution that is least likely to succeed. The stuff you should focus on are the generals issuing orders to criminally bomb cities. Yeah, that's the offender you really need. And even though the propaganda is at the root cause of it, unfortunately, international criminal law is not going to be the solution for that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sometimes it's really very good to focus on main issues during the ongoing war and not to be spreading the different points. Marco, during our conversation, I got so many new questions that I guess we can record many new Just Talks in future talking about specific points you just said. I already see a few questions in the chat, and we can, I guess, smoothly moving to the question answers part of our conversation. Before that, I just wanna tell to our audience that please, if you wanna, now everyone, I guess, can turn on cameras, and if you wanna take a floor and ask your questions, please don't forget to turn on the language of the translation you see in the bottom of your screen. And I will start from the questions from the chat, and then we can just raise up your hand and we'll give you space to answer the question. So I will read in Ukrainian and you'll get in translation. The first question is from Mykola Havronyuk. He's asking,
Mr. Milanovic, I have a question for you. Whether the following situation is possible. The ad hoc tribunal that was created for trying the crime of aggression after the leadership of Russian Federation is convicted for the crime of aggression, then continues its work and continues prosecuting the same persons, but now it will be no longer about the crime of aggression, but war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide.
Excellent. Now I get it. So yes, it's possible, but it's not a good idea. Okay. Now, the reason why that's the case is that proving these crimes is a very, very, very different task. It's reasonably easy to prove that Russia, A, committed aggression, and that B, Vladimir Putin, and maybe a few other people are responsible for that crime. You can hold that trial in a couple of weeks. It's not that complicated. Yeah. Aggression is simply, a violation of the prohibition of the use of force that is manifest by its character, gravity, and scale. Yeah, that's what aggression is. It's fairly easy to say, Russia committed aggression, an act of aggression, and Putin was the leader in power who made that decision with the requisite degree of intention. We could have a trial tomorrow. We're not. It's not going to happen. But it's fairly easy to do, if you see what I mean. But it's a completely different ballgame to prosecute high-ranking leaders for atrocity crimes. Now, why is that? It's because they are very far removed from the scene of the crime. So it's not Vladimir Putin who ordered, or you are certainly not going to be able to prove it, who ordered Ukrainian cities to be indiscriminately shelled for civilians to be deliberately targeted. No, there's 10 layers of officials between the people who committed the crime and high-level leaders. And the most difficult part of international criminal trials is to create this so-called linkage evidence, linking high-level perpetrators to crimes committed by hundreds, if not thousands, of immediate perpetrators. And those trials last years and often fail, right? So you don't really want to mix these two things up the way it was in Nuremberg. It's much easier to simply prosecute for aggression in absentia or in the presence of the accused, and to have separate trials for the atrocity crimes.
Thank you very much, Marco. I see here a lot of questions from the user with the name V, and I believe this is Pan Volodymyr Mykolaievich Сущенко. So, пане Володимире, можливо, ви хочете? Доброго дня, вітаю.
Good afternoon, Volodymyr. Good afternoon. I'm happy to see everyone. That is correct. I actually wrote 3 questions, but I have to admit that you actually answered one of the questions that I had. The key question that I wanted to ask, what would be the consequences for the state that gets a verdict against it? And I'm not talking just about the officials in the case, but I'm talking about the country in general, the policy of the country. I don't think much would change in their minds, of course, but what about the national policy? We had Nuremberg. there was a court decision 80 years after. We see that it didn't do much to affect the mindsets and the minds of the Russians, because basically they created a new Hitler. So my question is, could the tribunal do something with the very ideology?
I suppose in principle it could, but I don't think courts are the solution to deal with poisonous ideologies. You know, these are political problems, moral problems that require really political solutions. And courts are a very marginal part of that. It's not the Nuremberg Tribunal that cured Germany from Nazism. You know, it was a process that lasted for decades of the transformation of the German society into the kind of reasonably nice society that it is today. And actually, immediately after the end of the trials, once the occupying powers gave Germany a measure of self-government, the Nuremberg trials were immediately forgotten in Germany. For decades, you had amnesia in Germany about the responsibility of Germans and Germany for the crimes committed, especially against the Jews. So the great sort of reckoning of Germans with their past happens 20 years later. And after a succession of generations, after sort of this poisonous nationalism was no longer transmitted to the next generation and so on. So, I mean, my simple answer is that courts don't solve these problems at their root. They deal with symptoms, with some aspects of it, but they do not solve these problems at their root. When it comes to your more formal legal question about state responsibility, in principle, there are courts like the International Court of Justice that can establish state responsibility, even in cases of mass atrocities. Actually, my country, Serbia, was sued by both Bosnia and Croatia for allegedly committing genocide in Bosnia and Croatia. The end result, though, was a disappointment for both Bosnia and Croatia. In Croatia, the court said there was no genocide. In Bosnia, the court said there was only one genocide, Srebrenica, but Serbia was not responsible for it. It was committed by the Bosnian Serbs, whose conduct was not that of Serbia. And Serbia was found responsible for failing to prevent genocide. The consequences of that conviction were symbolic. Nothing really changed. Nothing deeply changed. So in theory, you could have some kind of claims commission that would decide on reparations that Russia would owe to Ukraine for all the damage caused to Ukraine. The problem is, without Russia's consent, it is impossible to really enforce any kind of decision like that. So that's sort of what I can say about state responsibility.
Дякую дуже. Дякую.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Бачу у чаті Катерина Котельва, ви включилися, так?
Katerina asking a question in the chat. I can see your camera is on. Good afternoon. I have two questions for Marco. I'm a judge in a district court in Ukraine. And my first question is about how efficient modern international tribunals are. Yevhen started a discussion by saying that the Nuremberg Tribunal is not the best example for Ukraine, but I would like to disagree because it turned out to be efficient and it was time saving. I think the duration of a case average was a year. In Yugoslavia, it was around 20 years and something like that in one case. There's a joke about a young lawyer who asks his father, a senior lawyer, and he says, I had a case and it was over in one hearing. That was the case that you spent 10 years working on. And the father says, silly you, it took you one hearing to end the case that kept the money flowing to our family for 10 years. And I think as far as the tribunals are concerned, if it's 10 years after the events, there's not much to look into. No witnesses, problems with evidence, evidentiary issues. So I'm interested in how efficient modern day tribunals are. And depending on what you say, I'll ask my second question.
Thank you so much, Katerina. That's an excellent question. And there's an easy answer. Modern international criminal tribunals are horribly inefficient things. So they produce decade-long trials where all these British barristers and American lawyers talk about all sorts of complicated legal and factual questions. They drill down into every single teeny tiny bit of evidence. They produce judgments that are 2,000 pages long that nobody reads, okay? And they're horribly expensive as well. Translation costs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you're right that the big benefit of the Nuremberg Tribunal, that it was relatively speedy. The whole thing was finished from start to finish was 1 year. No modern international criminal trial lasted that shortly. I mean, none of them, unless the defendant died, basically. Yeah. So that's a big problem. That's a huge problem. Part of the problem is that these modern cases tend to be against higher level defendants, and they involved an enormous number of specific events. Milosevic, for example, who died while he was being tried in the ICTY, he was tried at the same time for crimes in Kosovo, in Bosnia, in Croatia, right? It was an impossibly big case, huge case. So that is an issue. So, and the ICC, the Permanent International Criminal Court, is no better. It's even worse than the ad hoc tribunal. It takes ages to get cases. So one benefit of domestic prosecutions, whether in Ukraine or in countries, third countries like Poland or Lithuania or whoever, who might exercise universal jurisdiction, is that you might be able to do them much more quickly, to have much more modest cases that focus on one specific event, a couple of specific defendants, and get them done as reasonably quickly as possible. This was done later, by the way, here, by domestic courts in Bosnia and in Serbia and in Kosovo and so on. So these are much more manageable cases. As things stand, you have some potential defendants in your custody. You have prisoners of war whom you can try for war crimes, but not for other crimes. The issue is whether you will be able to do so. Because, you know, prisoners might get exchanged, repatriated, and so on. And then there's the big issue of, do you do in absentia trials? And what is the benefit and what are the drawbacks of trials where you don't have custody over the accused? So that's like the big sort of efficiency kind of questions you can think of.
Thank you very much. You have answered the second question I had, which precisely pertained to whether we can cope domestically, whether we can use our domestic courts and try these cases perhaps more effectively. Incidentally, until recently, we had military courts, military tribunals, which had the relevant jurisdiction and had the specialized training As an attorney, I had the experience of litigating in the military tribunals, and I can share firsthand that they heard complicated cases, 4 working days, say from 9 to 5 for 6 months. It was day by day hearing, whole working week in and out. This was difficult on the attorneys, but this is the way they heard cases, and they would resolve the case in 6 months with the volumes of evidence and multiple witnesses. They would have the case over and the verdict passed in 6 months. So this is my response, and you have answered my second question, and I'm grateful to you. Perhaps we could draw some lessons from this experience as the Ukrainian judges, as I feel that some cases will be placed for our considerations, and we'll be sitting on these cases.
Marco, I have seen no questions anymore. I guess your speech was so full with details and information. So we can, finishing our today's event and meeting, I want to say big thanks to you once again. It was a pleasure to see you here in JustTalk event. As Evgeny said on the beginning, that we are back after some pause and now back online and doing our events. We'll hopefully do it more often. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who listened to us, who asked questions. We'll be back and see you soon. Thank you, Marco.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Bye-bye.